Hi, welcome to episode 13 of The Agency Way, a Room 214 weekly Blab series to help marketers learn from subject matter experts within a marketing agency, in addition to guest thought leaders in business and marketing worldwide. My name is Erica Stutzman, and I am the editorial director at Room 214, a social and digital marketing agency. Our usual host, Room 214's co-founder, Jason Cormier, is actually out today, so I'm going to try down to hold the fort myself. My guest today is Wilma Cruz. She is an account director at Room 214. For 7 years, Wilma has helped national and global brands gain visibility in the digital space, build trust within the marketplace, and genuinely connect with their audience. She has worked with brands including Hyatt, Bud Light, Absolut, Samsung, and Sanrio. Welcome to the show, Wilma. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited. Slightly terrified, but really excited.
This is really easy. You can ask some of our regulars. I see Bill is here and some of the other folks. It's really easy.
Okay, cool.
Tell me a little bit about your background and how you got involved with social and digital marketing.
I'm going to try and do this without dating myself. Oh my God, my background. So I started in hotels doing marketing and PR, always loved social media. I was one of the very early people on Facebook back when it was the Facebook. Yeah, and you could like upload your class schedule, and it was a lot different than it is now. But always had a really genuine interest in social and saw a lot of potential in it for brands and for businesses. And so when I was doing marketing and PR for hotels, I was paid a lot of attention to social and tried to incorporate as much as possible. And then when I made the move to agencies, it was really not about leaving hotels, but more about wanting to dive deeper into social. And so, yeah.
What was some of the work that you were doing early on, sort of the emerging socials that you were doing for hotels?
Oh my gosh, it was really based around events. I think that early on hotels, before there was a huge dive into social, a lot of the communication happened through these emails that seemed to come from the GM. And so so I worked at the W. It's a very different demographic. It's a very perfect demographic for social. So it was a lot of taking a look at how they were communicating in general and seeing how the brand could fit in. And I think the W hotels in general did a really, really good job of positioning themselves within the digital space with their target. And so it was a lot of promoting events, promoting sales, not a lot of stuffy talk. It was very laid back, very in tune with the W target.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So what are some of the social tools, either legacy or emerging, that you really like for storytelling? Because I think what we want to do is help everybody who's viewing this today, not just use the social tools that they're already familiar with, but do it in a way that tells a story. So what are some of those social platforms that you like to use, and how can you leverage that for storytelling for brands?
Yeah, so I think I'm not particular with one platform. I don't think you almost want to think about storytelling for a brand the way you tell your stories to your friends, and you would never use one way. You would never just use text message to tell your story to your friends. You would do it in person. You would do it through an email or through a phone call. And so that's kind of how I look at storytelling for brands. So you want to have a really solid, almost like a digital ecosystem where you're using a bunch of different platforms to tell your story, but not telling the story in the same way for each platform, because it's a different group of friends. They talk differently, they act differently. So I think if I had to pick a couple core, I think a good mix is probably Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Okay.
The behavior on them is so different. One is very visually focused. The other is very fast paced. And then Facebook is really that, like, it has a longer shelf life for your content. So I think if you work the three of those really well, you have a good way of telling your story in different ways.
How do you integrate those three then? Because you're talking about, so if I'm a brand and I have a certain story to tell, and maybe I've created my archetype and I've created sort of a story arc, how do I use those three together without sort of like losing track of my core story?
Mm-hmm. So the first, and I think this is the most important thing when you're trying to tell a story or even create a story for a brand, is making sure that you have a really you're really solidly positioned. If your positioning is solid, whatever you do moving forward is always going to come back to that positioning. Your story arc is always going to be really solid. So initially you want to pick a hub. You want to pick one of those platforms to be your core, where fans can always go back to, or that's the place that's going to drive them to other platforms to hear different, almost have different perspectives of the story. So that's kind of what's connecting everything, because you have that hub. Typically, I'll use Facebook to act as the hub. It's either Facebook or a landing page, something that gives you the ability to have content live a little bit longer and have it be in a longer format. So you're not restricted to like a character limit or anything.
Okay. And I've got better questions for you, but one thing that I want to talk about, because we're talking to a pretty wide audience at this point, is how there was always these warnings early on, and not when you were on the Facebooks, but a little more recent than that. A lot of warning is about just sort of overloading people with content and maybe not using it too much, or maybe scheduling it in such a way that would be like perfectly synchronated with other things. And what is your feeling on that advice?
On not overloading your audience?
Yeah, like not doing it too much, or not like sending out too much content.
I think it goes back to that idea of thinking of yourself as the storyteller amongst friends. And so it's really about knowing your friends. So do your due diligence, get to know your audience, know how they talk. No two audiences are the same. So there are some audiences that will be overloaded and be like, this is way too much content. I don't understand what's happening. And there are others that are like, this isn't enough. Like, I need it faster. I need it quicker and shorter. So really know who you're talking to, and then you can sort of develop your story around that. Okay, great. There's some key components of traditional storytelling that brands need to leverage, and it seems like the risk of just sort of relying on what a new platform is, so not necessarily the Instagrams and the Facebooks, it's, something new and merging. It seems like you could forget the whole storytelling point of, the point that you were trying to make. How do you talk to brands about that? How to leverage the new things without losing that tradition? So I'm a fan of taking risk, granted calculated risk, whatever makes sense for the brand. So I'm always excited to see brands venture into new platforms and leverage new technology to tell their story. I think one example would be, we're seeing it more and more in terms of virtual reality. And I know that Samsung has been a really good leader in that realm. And so I'm super excited to see how they incorporate that into their storytelling, because it is going to be groundbreaking, and it is going to be a new way for the rest of us to sort of discover different ways to tell our story. What I would tell a brand that, let's say I wanted them to do virtual reality, first you have to see, again, what their positioning is. Like, does this, for their core story, does this make sense for them? Because if it's a more conservative brand, maybe it doesn't make sense. Maybe it won't connect or resonate with their audience. So that's why I say calculated risk. You really have to make sure that when you go to take that risk, or you want to try something new, that it makes sense for the brand and that it adds value to the brand. You can't just do it to do it. I know visual storytelling is becoming also super, super huge. And one of the battles that a lot of brands have with it is you have the ability to create beautiful visuals, really stunning artwork. But if it's almost too surface, too superficial, and it doesn't relate back to your story, it's going to be fleeting, and it's not going to have any sort of long-lasting impact on your brand or the story you're trying to tell. Let's talk about some of that impact that you just mentioned. Tell me about some brands that you've worked on, or even ones that you've just admired from afar that have done storytelling on social really well. What are some of the cooler campaigns you've seen or worked on? So one of the things that I love to do is sort of, and it's not strictly focused on social, I kind of really love the brands that tell a story and you don't even realize that the storytelling's happened until you sort of sit back after a little bit and you're like, oh my God, that was awesome. I think we most recently saw this with Straight Outta Compton and Dr. Dre. It was interesting, and I know some of the pieces of it are a little controversial, but I think the fact that the movie itself was timely in how it was released. When you look at the subject matter in the movie and then what's going on in our reality with that same subject matter in terms of tension with a certain community and the police department, and that's what's happening in the movie as well. And so the fact that they were smart in their marketing to know when to release it, the fact that they were also incorporating different avenues. So having things go viral, like the straight outta memes that were really cute at first, and then they got really annoying and you wanted it to go away, but everyone knew about it. And people who weren't necessarily in their target audience for that movie, for this story, now knew about it. And we're a part of the story. We're an active part of the story in taking little actions like creating a meme themselves and sharing it. They're being active participants in the storytelling. I think when you watch the movie and you see Dre and oversized headphones, you're immediately thinking Beats. And that's just part of his story. So he didn't know back then that he was going to develop Beats, but that's the case.
He might have, actually.
Probably. I don't think I can underestimate how smart he is. I know I definitely did. So it's definitely very smart. I think there was a little bit of, I wouldn't say political activity going on, but the fact that one of the first trailers for the movie happened during some sort of like Republican debate. I mean, you're getting in front of an audience that wouldn't normally pay attention to your movie. And so when you sit back and you're like, okay, they did all of these things to tell their story to different audiences in different ways through different channels, it's really pretty brilliant. Mm-hmm. Now you see the substance behind Dre and his industry, his companies. You see the substance in it, you see the core, and you understand it. You may not necessarily agree or even be into it, but like, you have to admit he did a really good job.
Well, and I think I hear you saying two things here, because you're talking about using social not only to communicate something that ties the brand into what's happening in the world, right? So it's making it relevant to everyone. And then you're also talking about this real fan interaction where people are making their own memes and where people are kind of taking the story in their own direction. And so that's kind of using social in those two vectors, two different directions that really worked for the movie.
Yeah, I think that speaks to the evolution we're seeing in storytelling, where before it was heavily focused on, and still is to a certain degree, on telling the story. And now brands who are really leading this area are focused on creating a story. And part of creating that story in the moment is allowing enough flexibility in your storytelling or story creation to incorporate fans and to let them be a part of that story and help mold it and shape it. And it's a little nerve-wracking for brands sometimes, because you lose a little bit of control and you have to allow for a specific margin of error. But at the end of the day, you end up with creating a story that you can then retell and share that's really genuine, that resonates with your audience, that ends up being really unique and dynamic because there were things you didn't expect and plan for.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
Let's get to some just best practices, which I hate that term, but let's talk about just some really practical tips that anybody watching this can use, or anybody who replays it later on. What are sort of the three best things that brands can do using social for storytelling, and what are some three big don'ts?
Okay, so for the do's, you have to have a strong positioning. If you need an example, look at Nike. They did it so well that when they started before social doing ads in the 90s, they didn't even have to push a product. They could tell stories that they wanted to, and their positioning was so strong and fans believed in it so much that whatever they threw out, everyone was like, yeah, that makes sense, and I believe in their brand, I'm going to buy the product. What else? Know your audience. There is no better indicator for the type of content you should be sharing, the type of story you should tell, whether you're hitting the mark or not, than your audience. And they're always honest, regardless of whether you like what they're saying or not. They're super audience, and they're just really, really insightful. There's so much you can gain from just listening, not even to what they're saying to you, but what they're saying to each other, how they speak. For an example of that, I think Taco Bell is a really strong leader in everything that they do comes from fan insights. And so when you see them really pushing for emojis, that's not just because it's cool, it's because that's how their audience speaks.
Mm-hmm.
They speak with emojis versus words. And so I think knowing your audience is really, really strong, is a really strong do. The third one, if I had to pick a third one, oh my God, don't be afraid to fail. Don't be afraid to try something new. When you tell a story, it has to be impactful. It has to be something that people want to listen to, and it has to be worth sharing. So take the risk, take the risk that makes sense for your brand. And if it doesn't work, you're going to learn something from it. I don't think it's ever going to be like, I got nothing from that experience.
Right.
For don'ts, I guess I kind of want to say, like, don't be a follower. Just because it worked for somebody else doesn't mean it's going to work for you. Don't tell someone else's story thinking it'll apply to your brand. I mean, your brand is cool. It's unique. You have a story to tell. Don't take someone else's. It goes in line with the do of listening to your fans. Don't ignore them. Don't give in to navel gazing and only speaking to yourself and telling a story that you want to hear. Tell the story you know your fans want to hear. Mm-hmm. A third don't stick to one channel. You don't just have one dimensional audience. They talk in different ways, different places. Again, learn about them and then spread yourself around, develop a really strong strategic digital ecosystem and leverage it as much as you can.
Yeah, very good. We also got a good comment from Martha here who's saying, don't change your personality just because you want to jump on a platform either.
Right. Yeah. If it doesn't make sense for your brand, don't do it. It's better to be true to who you are versus going there and then having people call you out on it.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, believe it or not, we've run out of our 20 minutes about, so I'm going to close out, but I want to thank you so much. These are all super practical tips that I think any brand or any company, frankly, could use as far as using social. So thank you so much, Wilma.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
Oh, good. I told you to go fast.
More fun than terrifying, for sure.
So really quickly, every week we try to finish up with the funny, which are just little recommendations of things that we really like this week. And for my part, my book recommendation for the week is Winning the Story Wars by Jonah Sachs. It's something that as an agency we've really embraced, and I think almost everybody in the building at this point has read it. It's a very easy read, but it also kind of follows some very cool structures where it's almost like a textbook for storytelling. So if your company or agency or even just your small firm wants to talk about storytelling, it's a really good book to pick up. I recommend it. Our shout out of the week is to storycorps.org, which is a nonprofit organization. It's a 501c3, so it is nonprofit, but they are really dedicated to the idea that every life and every single story has meaning. Not only do they tell the best stories, but it really drills down the idea that every person and every story has a deep impact on the people who to hear about them or the stories themselves. And my quote of the week is inspired by the fact that I was literally stuck in my house yesterday by 5 feet of snow. And so my quote is by Henry David Thoreau, and it is, "We need the tonic of the wilderness." So thank you all so much for joining us today. As a reminder, you can follow us on Twitter at room_214. You can also subscribe to our email newsletter by going to room214.com/blog. Please feel free to message me anytime. Today I'm signed on as Room 214, but you can see my other handle, The Agency Way, is up there. Please scroll up and contact me if you would like to be a guest on our show. And thanks again for joining us. Thank you, Wilma. I appreciate you so much.